Hello and welcome to Property Money Trees Maximising Property Values, the once a month show where I break down the steps of how to recognise, enhance, and then extract the values in property in order to create wealth. Would you like to find out how you can benefit from the steps of maximising property values? This is even if you don't own a property yet or have a deposit. If that's a yes, then you're in the right place to find out. My name is Patricia Faber, and although many know me for my work as a solicitor, on this show you will be getting the benefit of my 30 plus years worth of experience of maximising property values, experience which has given me a net worth in millions. So who might benefit from listening to this show? Literally anyone with an interest in creating property wealth. Welcome back. So this month I want to start my deep dives into the Renters' Rights Bill of 2024. It is worth noting that it will only apply to residential tenancies given to individuals who live in the premises as their main homes. So let me just put that caveat there. If you take someone into your own home, so you have lodgers, it won't apply to you. So let me just quickly say that before I get into the nitty-gritty of what this podcast is going to be about. So on the 11th of September, the current government, the Labour government, published a bill. So this is like a draft Act of Parliament to do with renters. And it's called the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, you may remember the Renters' Reform Bill of 2023, which the previous government, the Conservative government, published. And there were so many arguments about the different clauses in it. It was never passed in Parliament, so it didn't become law. Now, why am I talking about this particular bill when I didn't talk about the Renters' Reform Bill? Now, the Conservative Party was divided, and apart from that, there were so many factions just arguing against one another. It was fairly clear that their draft Act of Parliament, the Reform Bill, was never going to be passed by Parliament in the form in which it was drafted. Fast forward quite a few months and we've got the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, Labour is in a very different position because Labour has enough majority to pass the bill into an Act of Parliament. And not only that, it has told its members that if they vote against the government, the whip will be withdrawn from them. And this means that the MP in question can be expelled from the Labour Party to become an independent. So that in itself is making most Labour MPs toe the line. And that makes the Renters' Rights Bill very important in that it could well become law as is currently drafted. So this particular episode, I want to talk about rents. So I'm going to do a series of these podcasts to deep dive into the various bits that I think affect most developer landlords. So when we talk about rents, most of us will think about rents in two ways. One, the rent that we ask for before we actually let to a tenant, and I will call that initial rent. So in this podcast, I shall refer to that as the initial rent. And then we also talk about the additional rent that we might ask for once a tenant's been in place for a while. So up until now, so if we think about the current law, You could have a fixed term tenancy and you could say after 6 months the rent is going to go up to X amount, or after a year it's going to go up to Y amount, or you could say after 12 months the rent will be reviewed using, you could say, a retail price index, or you could have your own formula of actually increasing the rents. Now, come the rights bill, once that becomes law, you won't be able to do that. You will only be able to increase your rents if you go through a particular formula. Now, well, I say formula, not quite formula, but procedure, that's what I meant to say. Now, that procedure is actually in place now. So if you had a fixed term tenancy, an AST, for a year, and you'd moved on to a statutory periodic tenancy, meaning that the terms of your tenancy were actually applied going forward apart from the fixed term that you had initially. So it then becomes a rolling tenancy, usually on a month by month basis. So if you had one of those and you wanted to put your rents up, you had to go through what was called a Section 13 procedure. And to do that, you'd go onto the government website, you'd download what was called a Form 4, and you'd fill that in and give it to your tenant, giving at least a month's notice to the rent being increased. Now, the tenant would then have the opportunity and right to challenge that rent in the tribunal. And if the tribunal decided that the tenant was right and the increased rent was too much, the tribunal could either say, the previous rent is what is going to apply, or it could say what you asked for was too much, but this amount is what is going to apply going forward. However, that decision would be backdated to the date that your notice to your tenant expired. So that's a situation at the moment. You could fit. Okay, to do with initial rents, again, you had the complete authority to fix your rents unless they were significantly higher than the rents charged for similar properties on the same street. So first of all, you'd have to have quite a number of comparables on the same street, and then your rents would have to be significantly higher. So that's kind of like where we are with the current law. Now, let's now compare that to what the rights bill is wanting to provide. So to do with initial rents, so that is the rent that you decide on when you are going to let your property to someone, any tenant can challenge that in the tribunal now, as long as they do so within 6 months of the tenancy actually starting. So one, there might not be lots of comparables, and your rent doesn't need to be shown to be significantly higher than what those comparable properties are actually charging. Any tenant can challenge your initial rent, and they can do so the very moment that you give them the keys to your property. As I said before, they'd have to do it within the first 6 months of the tenancy starting though. Another difference is that if they go to tribunal, the tribunal can now, if the rights bill becomes law as currently drafted, decide on a lower rent, which they can't do now under the current law, even if it's not significantly higher. Secondly, on these initial rents, the new rent, if lower, can, depending on what the tribunal decides, take effect at any time up to the time when your tenant put the application into the tribunal. So imagine this. You rent your property on, say, the 1st of February. You give the keys to the person that you've agreed upon. You've done your referencing. They seem very nice. You've done all your due diligence. You actually chose this tenant out of another 25. But as soon as you give them the keys, they had pre-drafted an application to the tribunal to say that the rent was too high, and they lodge it that same day. So how much exactly is your rent for that tenancy? You'll never know. So if that clause isn't changed, that will be the situation that we're all in. We won't know. We'll have no certainty of contract. And what then will happen to our mortgages? Because most of our mortgages, buy-to-let mortgages, are granted on the basis that we'll be able to get so much rent, for our properties and or whatnot. So what is going to happen then? So just be aware of this. This is it's a big change from the law that we have right now. And that's to do with initial rents. And remember, this challenge can only be made within the first 6 months of the tenancy. So in the example that I gave, they can only do so up until the end of July. So again, I've written a piece on LinkedIn. You can find it if you go onto LinkedIn, search for me, Patricia Faber. You will see what I've written, where I've explained that this bill is looking to completely disregard contract, the law of contract. Because what happens is when you advertise your property for rent, what you're doing is you're actually inviting offers. And in legal terms, that is called an invitation to treat. Then when a tenant sees, or potential tenant sees your advert and they decide they want it, they come to you and they make you an offer and they say, oh yes, I'm really interested in renting from you. It could be at the same rent. It could be at a lower rent. Currently, it could be at a higher rent, which again will no longer be permissible once the bill becomes an act, because you can now only advertise your property at a set price, and you cannot encourage bidding wars, and you must let at the price that you advertised. Anyway, that to one side. So they make you an offer. You carry out all your due diligence because you're aware of things like this, and you decide, yes, you're going to let to this particular person. When you tell them that you're happy to let to them, that is you accepting their offer. And then a legal contract comes into being. Even though it's not yet written, it comes into being then. But what the bill is saying is forget about all of that. That doesn't apply. So landlords will no longer have the contractual certainty of offer and acceptance, which underpins commerce everywhere in the world. You need certainty of contract. If you don't have certainty, do you know what you're doing? I wouldn't know what I'm doing. So that's that on initial rents. On the rent increases, again, it's different, but not so different. So I guess you could say it is quite different, but I'll try and highlight where the differences actually arise. So currently, if you'd written your rent review clauses into your contracts, they would prevail. If the bill becomes law, then no, you can't do that. You cannot put a rent review clause into your contract. Not allowed at all. And I'm going to do another podcast on the fines and penalties if you step out of line regarding what the bill says if it gets passed as it currently reads. So you only really would put yourself into a tribunal situation if your fixed tenancy had moved on and had become a statutory periodic tenancy. The bill is proposing that every single tenancy be a monthly tenancy, and all that the tenant would have to do is give you 2 months notice, but I'm not going to go into that in depth right now, just so that you know. However, any rent increase, you have to use the procedure which currently you only had to use right now if you had a statutory periodic tenancy. So I don't know what the form is going to be, but let's assume it's going to be the same form. You fill in the form 4, you give it to your tenant, but this time around you'd have to give 2 months notice. So it's gone up from 1 month to 2 months. And then if your tenant's not happy with the increase that you're asking for, they can go to tribunal. Now, previously, if they did go to tribunal and the decision went your way, the tenant had to pay the higher rent from the date that your notice expired. So it would be backdated. If the bill becomes law, the tenant doesn't have to pay before a decision is reached. And even when the decision is reached, the tribunal can also give them another 2 months period before the new rent takes effect. So you ask your tenant to pay more rent. They know that the tribunal is completely chocker and they're not getting round to actually looking at these things for a year, possibly 18 months. For all we know, in a year's time, it could be 2 years. Why wouldn't they apply to the tribunal to have the rent reviewed? Because what is going to happen? They're paying a current rent. And also, the tribunal cannot increase the rents that you've asked for, which I think they could currently, or they can currently. And furthermore, the tribunal can now reduce the rent from what you previously had. So let's say you were charging £1,000 a month, and then after a period of 12 months, because that is the only time when you can ask for the rent to be increased, so you then ask for it to go up. The tribunal, once it decides, let's say in 2 years' time, so the tenant has been there for 3 years, can actually say, well, actually, no, the rent should only be 900. The only good thing about that is that 900 cannot apply before the tenant decided to go to tribunal or notified the tribunal that they wanted the rent reviewed. But your rent can be decreased and it cannot be increased. And the date of so like I said, the date of the new rent can be any date up until the date that the tenant went to tribunal. So that can be backdated from the decision date. Just thought I'd let you guys know about how rents may well be affected going forward. You just need to be aware of it, and just put your plans into place. So if you want to talk about this, come onto Clubhouse, come into a room that I run, or message me, and as long as I don't get too many people asking me to kind of like deal with their queries, I shall try my best to come back to you with an answer. Now, the bill as it is new. It was published on the 11th of September. We're all still trying to get our heads around it, but I'd like to think that what I've put in this podcast is actually representative of what is in the bill and what the landscape is likely to be if the bill becomes an act of parliament unchanged. So there we are. Do take care. See you next month.